Happy Fifth Sunday. This is the day when usually we have like an all-family Sunday, so it's like especially chaotic. I'm a big fan of it because I have my kids with me. And I'm reminding them like, oh yeah, we're in church, like we shouldn't be talking. And then they're like, why? And I'm like, I actually don't know. So it's a very humbling day. So it's good to see everyone. If you don't know me, my name is Camille Hernandez. I am on the teaching team here at One Life. Oh, thanks guys. Hi. It's been, I think, maybe 8 months since I've last preached. So it feels good to speak with you all today. So I want to start the sermon by kind of recapping what we've been doing the last 2 weeks in the sermon series on embodying Christian leadership. So the first week, we had a panel discussion with men in the church about parenting and what it means to not only survive, but resist an authoritarian parenting style, and what men in the church have done in their own lives to survive and resist and move towards wholeness. And then last week we had women in the church who were like publicly processing their experience, listening to the first week, but also talking about what they had also experienced within Christian communities and within the church. And so, the question then becomes like, so what do these conversations about parenting, gender identity, and ending authoritarian relationships have to do with Christian leadership? And my very simple answer is that in order for us to pursue an honest journey towards a holistic and embodied Christianity, we have to expose the ways and the teachings and the ways that stopped us from our own holistic growth and from our own embodiment. And what's unfortunate is that wrongness or injustice, it's kind of like a yarn ball with lots of yarn. We want to untangle that ball of yarn, but there's so many pieces and so many ends, and we don't know how to. And honestly, the best way to do it is that you just pick a piece and you tug at it. But that means that there are so many ways that we have been kept from our authentic selves. And so today, I'm going to just focus on one barrier to success that we see a lot in the church, and that barrier is patriarchy. So, can I have the next slide, please? My favorite season is the fall of patriarchy. So, a lot of people assume that patriarchy is either a male-dominated society or that we focus on fathers and sons. And a part of it is true. But patriarchy is actually a systemic form of morality that causes hierarchies of belonging, as in like you belong at this top hierarchy, so you have power over people underneath you. And it assumes that every relationship is transactional. And then these transactions are determined by gender, by race, by socioeconomic class, religion, and beyond. And it's really important to understand that patriarchy impacts people in different ways according to their identities and cultures. So I am a Black and Asian woman. I have arthritis in my knees, so I'm disabled. And I experience patriarchy very differently than, let's say, like a single white woman, or an Asian male father, or a queer Black person. There's so many ways that one person can experience patriarchy. So to even say like, oh, I don't know that experience, it's actually pretty patriarchal, because you're not accepting the fact that everyone has different identities and different social locations, and we hurt differently. So this is what I created it. It's called the patriarchy iceberg. So a lot of people think that patriarchy is the top of the iceberg. So we have like men versus women. Turn around. Body shaming women, men controlling women's bodies, men raising boys to hate women, violence against women, women denied leadership roles, and then also like something that Taylor Swift sings about in her songs. But actually, patriarchy is this, which is the bottom of the iceberg. So I'll read all this to you guys. Classism, racism, ableism, upholding unattainable beauty standards, punishment as an educator, normalizing silence, anatomic and physiological ignorance, so that means like you don't understand how your body operates, shame, xenophobia, queerphobia, withholding permission, standards-based education models, collective denial, shame, inaccessibility to emotional healing, shame, creating barriers to curiosity, all or nothing, this or that mentality, trans erasures, worthiness is based on emotional suppression, and that includes toxic positivity, and then also slander-based systems of justice. So when we talk about patriarchy, it's not really about men versus women. It's about all of the systems that were created to make you feel like you had to be a worthy transaction to receive care. And there is a book by an author named Bell Hooks. I absolutely love her. I love reading her works. And she has spent like 40 years writing about patriarchy, dismantling it. And she has a book called The Will to Change, which is about men and patriarchy. So I'm not going to read the quotes, but there's these two quotes if you would like to read them or take a picture of them. So what she's saying is that when we assume that patriarchy is only about men, then we are allowing ourselves to give in to patriarchy. It's a paradox, right? If we say, oh, it's only about one thing, well, then we fall into the power struggle, and then we are unknowingly going into this lust for power. So then it makes us long for power, but for those of us who don't long for power, we amplify our victimhood. Very simple example of it is, raise your hand if you're a woman in the church. Raise your hand if you have been shamed because you wanted to pursue a life that was not supported by Christian ideologies. As in, maybe you wanted to pursue a career. Maybe you did not want to have children. Maybe you decided that you wanted to be in a relationship or a marriage where you shared leadership roles, or maybe you decided you didn't want to get married. Right? If that is you, then you have fallen under patriarchy. But if you're obedient to patriarchy, then you amplify your victimhood by saying, well, this is how God told us it's going to be. And then you share that mentality and that ideology, and you shame people into silence instead of actually pursuing what's good for what they want. And what they want, I don't know if it's always good for them, but it's important to know what people want to be their authentic selves. The second quote is, last slide. Wasn't done with bell hooks yet. The second quote is about the fact that we can't assume that ending patriarchy means that we hate on men or we stop men from leading. Because in order for patriarchy to exist, women have to support patriarchy. And the thing about patriarchy is that when we assume that we don't have men lead and we suppress them and silence them, well, then we're giving into the same system. I have been in feminist circles for a lot of my life, and I've met patriarchal women, I've met patriarchal feminists. It's the same. It's the same stuff. And so in order to recognize, well, actually, I do recognize that patriarchy is a system of violence. And so then the thesis, or the main question that we have, is who will we become without the lies that cage us, right? Who do we become if we don't listen to the things that tell you that you need to shame yourself, silence yourself, suppress yourself in order to fit in order to be the best transaction possible? Who are you when you allow yourself to live off of transformative care? Who are you when you allow yourself to be your authentic self and to change, and also to be in a community that supports that? So we're going to tug at this question by reading the story of a group of women and mothers who resisted power and patriarchy through their model of leading from their authentic selves. And we're reading from the book of Exodus, specifically the first chapter. So just some background information. The Hebrew people were the descendants of a man named Jacob, who was a patriarch. Jacob changed his name to Israel because he did a lot of shady things, and they were questionable, and he didn't want to get caught. So Jacob and his family were migrants who were seeking asylum in Egypt. And very complicated telenovela, as always, the Old Testament story is that they were embraced by, at that time, a Egyptian politician who just happened to be a son. But then a few generations had passed, and his descendants, who are also known as the Hebrew people, were outnumbering the Egyptians, and the Egyptian government decided to use carceral logic, which is a form of like a punishment mindset, to enslave the Hebrew people. And when that stopped working, the Pharaoh announced that they would use terrorism to maintain power over them. So let's go into the story, and I'll read it to everyone. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, kill him. But if it's a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives fear God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded to them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, why have you done this and allowed the boys to live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, well, because the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. So God dealt with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives fear God, he gave them families. So I'm going to start this first section with a question. Pretend you are an archaeologist or an anthropologist discovering the beginning of an undiscovered human civilization. What would be the first thing that you would look for? Don't be afraid to raise your hand. Cooking items? Okay. I like that answer. Anyone else? I'm sorry? Any tools. Okay, tools. Okay, written form of language. Okay, great. So there's an answer from a anthropologist. I totally forgot to put her name in the notes, but it's somewhere. I've seen the story. And she said the first sign of human civilization is a healed femur bone. That is the bone in your leg. And why? Because it communicates that there was a choice to take care of someone and to make sure that they were sustained enough to continue living. Because if your bone breaks, you're as good as dead in a hunter-gatherer society. So a healed femur bone shows human beings overcoming a hierarchy of belonging by saying, you deserve to live, and we will heal you, and we will stay with you. And so let's look back at the text. In verse 15, yes. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. And so I have a friend named Taj, and he is a spiritual director. And he has this way of reading scripture with me and not telling me anything. And I'm like, you graduated from Harvard. You should tell me things. But he always asks me questions. And the first question he always asks is, who has power? Who has power in this verse? I'll go ahead and answer. It's obvious to me that the king of Egypt has power because he's telling the midwives what to do. How do they maintain power? They're maintaining power through infanticide, which is the killing of babies. But how do the midwives, Puah and Shiphrah, resist the king of Egypt's instructions? They do it through prayer and care. And they created a system of care for each other because they understood that the regime they lived under would not do it for them. So they said, it is more important that we take care of our children, and it is more important that we extend our care to them. You guys came at a really good time. Hi, honey. So I named this because we have to recognize that care is a spiritual practice. And we live in a place that constantly reminds us that it has been built on various types of harm. War, capital punishment, trafficking. And in these reminders, I have to actively remind myself that care is a spiritual practice that exists on a spectrum. You can care about something or someone, and you can extend care. We don't always have capacity to extend care. A lot of us are limited. And then we feel guilty because we can't do things. And to me, I live that all the time. And so I say it's actually okay, because the fact that you care about something means that you're pushing humanity forward. And what's most important to me is that we recognize that we need to forward humanity instead of glorify violence. And then our action that comes after that, it came from a good place. It came from good soil. But we also have to know that accountability is a major aspect of care. And in a time when we're reminded of pastoral failures and abuse of power within the church, we have to recognize that accountability to the protection of the most vulnerable people, it must remain at our center, because that was where Jesus' center was. That's where God's center was. That's where Pua and Shifra Center was. And I'm thinking of this because I don't know if anyone knows, but I wrote a book. It came out last year, and it is about Christianity. Oh, thanks. It's about Christianity and sexual violence. And, you know, I wish I could tell you that I planned the book from beginning to end. I did not. It was a journey. And in that journey, I had 3 consecutive chapters on genocide. And it was like the hardest few months to write that. But after the book came out, I was talking to one of my friends, and he is a disability and theology scholar. And he read my book, and he said, you know, this is the first time that I've read anything that had to do with theology and genocide, all my years of scholarship. And I was like, oh, that's pretty weird. It's pretty interesting. A few months later, actually not a few months later, I think maybe not too soon after, Israel invaded Palestine. And then suddenly I had to be aware of what I wrote on a real level, very real level. And I didn't want to be like, I wrote one of the only books on the theology of genocide, because that was not, I just didn't want to do that. But at the same time, I personally was just like, what do I do with this? Like, what do I really believe? And did what I write and publish, does that match what I believe now? But the most interesting thing is that there is a reverend from Palestine. His name is Munther Isaac, and he is traveling the world talking about what is happening in Palestine. And he is writing a book on the theologies of genocide. And it's the first of its kind. And I thought that that was so sad. How terrible it is that we as Christians don't have scholarship on genocide. And we have to rely on the genius of a man whose whole country is facing atrocity. We have to rely on him to do that work now, when it should have been done ages ago. And so a lot of people ask me, like, Camille, what's your next book on? I don't know. And it's not that I'm confused, it's that I have to reconcile, as a Christian author, what does it mean to be human? Because theology has taught us how to not be human and how to value idea over people. And there is a movement now, right, to create theologies that value people over ideas. And it's hard. I see you clapping, Dave, thanks. So let's go to the next section. Also, I'm gonna go over time, guys. I'm so sorry, I'm just gonna apologize ahead of time. You know, in the Black church, we call these pastor minutes, so I'm gonna take mine. All right, so the next section of verses. The king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, "What have you done? Why have you done this and allowed the boys to live?" The midwives said to the Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwives come to them." I think that's so funny every time I read it. I'm like, that's such a lie. Ugh. Hey, babe, what's up? Why don't you go sit on this end? Thank you. I'm still momming as I preach. So I'm not sure if you've heard or experienced any sermons with Pua and Shifra. At this point, this is when people will be like, they went against the government and protected the babies and pro-life. I don't do that. That's just not who I am. because those kind of narratives also like romanticize like being an individual and like individually rebelling against the government, which like historically Western Christianity has done, but we can talk about that another time. What I am a fan of is looking at Pua and Shifra and recognizing that it was not actually just them that worked, right? When I gave birth to all of my children, there was like a text tree that was a part of it. My friend Melika's here. She was part of that text tree. She knows, right? When we give birth, it is a process that requires our whole community to be present and to pray and to provide care and to bring food and tell me that I don't need to clean my house for a week. You know, it's a lot. But it also reminds me that all forms of societal change happens because of the actions that happen behind closed doors when no one is looking. And as many of you know, I'm Filipino, which means that I'm fueled by two things, which is gossip and chicken adobo. You can gossip cat. So Filipinos are notorious gossips, but this has been a system of communication and connection that has kept us safe and aware of each other's needs. For 500 years, we have been resisting some form of power, some form of colonization. And in the same way, Hebrew women in Israel had an underground network of communication that allowed mothers to birth free from fear of domestic terrorism set by their own government. And even our modern word of gossip is a nod to the efforts that women have made to create systems of safety and connection to help them survive patriarchy. So the word gossip comes from the word God sib. And the word God sib is a shortened version of the word God sibling. And around the time, it was made popular around the time that King James decided to have the Bible translated into English. So they inserted the word gossip and then like called it a sin. But gossip, to be a God sibling is to be a part of the community of people, specifically women, who visit a mother after she gives birth. And then they start talking, as women do. And it's creating a system and a society of care and communication because they're able to just speak and say, not just like, look at your baby, they're so cute, but also say like, this is what I'm struggling with, and not having to have charades or pretend to be who they are not. And so the midwives in Egypt, Pua and Shifra, at the time of infanticide, were the architects of a gossip culture that was necessary to keep pregnant women safe and Hebrew babies alive. Now, I'll go back to being Filipino. From 1965 to 1986, the Philippines was under the cruel dictatorship of Ferdinand Marcos. It was real bad. And not many people understand how bad the dictatorship was, but if I say Imelda Marcos had 3,000 shoes, a lot of people know that. That was his wife. And so the dictatorship happened less than a century after they were violently colonized by Japan and Spain, and then survived a genocide constructed by the United States on their own land. And much like Pua and Shifra, gossip was the only way that our country and ethnic identity could persevere. And there's this picture from the 1986 People's Revolution of the Philippines that I like to behold when I think about the holiness of underground systems of care and communication. In this picture, there are two nuns, and behind them is just a range of Filipino people, a range of Filipino people who are standing. And the nuns, their bodies in this photo is the only protection from military and tanks, because what Ferdinand Marcos did was he imposed martial law. And in imposing martial law, that meant the government and the military can do whatever they wanted to the people. And so the people organized underground, created strategies, decided that they were going to stand up against this system of violence. They did that through gossip. And it was the nuns who said, we will stand and we will do our best to protect you because that's what Jesus called us to do. And even now, they're still alive. Well, actually, one of them is still alive. And they tell us, do not forget what we have done, because now Ferdinand Marcos' son is the president of the Philippines. And they say, remember why we stood in front of the tanks. Remember why we were here to take care of each other. This is the only way we get our freedom. And I think we need to discern the times when we're invited to move bravely in society, when we can name wrongdoing and organize to dismantle violence. And I also think that if we're going to pursue any form of God's justice and life thereafter, then we need to maintain connection with one another and strengthen our bonds in ways that are unseen. Patriarchy is about making violence very public. To subvert it, we organize in ways that are silent. In churches, we listen to sermons, we have Bible studies, we go to our friend's house, we deliver food, we care. Connection is always care. And my last part is on culture. So I talked about care, then connection, and now culture. And there are people in the world who think that the opposite of patriarchy is to have women in charge and call it matriarchy. It's actually not how matriarchies work. It's a completely different cultural, political, economic system that, like, personally, as a member of the church, I don't think that we're, like, equipped for, because it overwhelms me. But what we are definitely ready for is a conversation of how God blesses us as violent regimes persist. And so the Bible verse that ends this section would be, so God dealt with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives fear God, he gave them families. And I think it's wrong for us to say, like, oh, the blessing is that you became a mother. Motherhood is great. I love it. But becoming a mother is actually, it's a part of the journey, but we can't centralize it as, like, the only path to holiness. And when we do, we uphold this idea that, like, you have to be a rugged individual to do motherhood right. It's not true. I don't want to romanticize biblical motherhood into a rugged Western idea of individuality, because then it makes victimhood holiness, and that we have to dominate others through gaslighting, shame, and silence. So instead, let us recognize that the blessing in the scripture is God's invitation to transform Pua and Shifra's roles within their community. Scripture doesn't say they stopped being midwives. It said they started being mothers, which means they were dependent on the interdependence of their community of care. If someone called them in the middle of the night to help with a birth, they had to leave their children with someone, right? Hey, dude, what's up? And so I'm going to call this auntie culture, which is something that I'm just really enjoying studying and thinking about. An auntie culture is a system of community elders, some people have children and some don't, who tend to each other's mental health, physical care, and families. Many ethnic groups within the global majority recognize that aunties and godmothers are the curators of prayer, of culture, and of care. And to be an auntie or an uncle goes against the idea that you have to be everything all the time, because you can be imperfect. You can have flaws and specialties, and you can operate of that in a community guided by protecting the younger generations. And you know what's true? Jesus had aunties, right? They fundraised for him. We all think that was some maintenance. No, it was an auntie who was pushy and took money. They were with him when he was standing during trial. They wept when he was a victim of state-sanctioned violence and capital punishment. His aunties showed up in his life, his suffering, his death, and his resurrection. There's a quote, we're in election season, so, like, everything's politicized. And we're talking, like, the media talks about, like, childless cat ladies, blah, 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 and it's very interesting. But Tracy Ellis Ross came out with this quote about how we don't need to shame women who don't have children, because our aunties have pushed humanity forward. She said, you don't need to push out a baby to push humanity forward. We create systems of care, of identity, of love, and that moves the culture forward. And so I'm going to end with this story of a picture. This is my grandma, Nanang Lilay. She's actually not my biological grandma. She is my cousin's grandma. Hey, buddy, can I finish? And then you can floss in front of everyone. Yeah? Okay. Cool. Oh, you're welcome. These are my kids, in case anyone didn't know. So my grandma, She was the first one to hold me when my biological grandma died. She was so filled with empathy and care, but she was like kind of crazy. You know, she's like in her 70s with like a bolo knife cutting down like leaves of a tree, you know? She got COVID during the pandemic and she lived, and we were like, nothing will kill grandma. And like at family parties, she would like walk around. It's like so vulgar. She'd walk around and like grab her boob and be like, "Who's hungry? I'm gonna feed you." I was like, "Oh my God, this lady's so embarrassing." But then I sat with her and heard her story. So she's from the Philippines. She lived in the Philippines, and before the Marcos regime, the Philippines was still recovering from a genocide that happened, caused by the US, renamed the Philippine-American War. She was a young mom, and she would breastfeed babies, abandoned babies, and took care of them. She lived with my mom, and like, my mom was one of 10. Like, she lived with at least 7 of them in a 1-bedroom shanty in Manila, and she called them the best days of her life. And she had so much love. And she died last year in June, and it was really hard. But I'm really glad you're dancing, Malachi. Thanks. Praise dance. But by December, I was going through something very terribly difficult, and I was talking to one of my cousins about it. And then she said, "Do you feel like you're going through a spiritual crisis right now?" And I was like, "Yeah, I guess that's the word for it." And my cousin said, We've been without grandma's prayer coverage for months. I miss her so much. When a woman like that prays for you, God listens. You are covered, you are cared for, and when she passes away and it's gone, you can feel it. I know this from personal experience. I'll be honest, I don't think that this sermon is going to end patriarchy. That was never the intention of me speaking. Thanks, baby. But the intention of me speaking was to say that we can survive it in ways that are authentic to ourselves and lets us flourish and lets our children flourish. I believe that is who Jesus has always been. That there are people who say, like, Jesus was a feminist and Jesus was anti-patriarchal, and yes, that is very true, because patriarchy expresses itself in authoritarianism, denial, shame, and silence. And last week, Liz said something about Jesus that I just haven't stopped thinking about, that he was everything that the people didn't expect. So the unfortunate part about being human is that we have many cages and many lies that we hear, and it shapes our expectations. And what I love about Jesus is that he never swayed. When the people wanted a king, he told them to take care of each other. When the people wanted a great public speaker, he told them to listen to the land. And when the people wanted a warrior, he sacrificed himself so that we could understand that we'll never flourish in an empire that is built on terror. That is what it means when we say Jesus didn't want us to live in patriarchy. The Hebrew women needed Puah and Shiphrah. And God blessed the midwives by giving them an invitation to enter a culture of interdependence. And I know that we say that our misfortune is that we'll never know the end of patriarchy or the fall of it. But our blessing is that we lead each other to grow beyond the cages that bind us. And I want us to hold on to that, because there are many cages, But there are so many more ways to flourish, and we can pursue it, but we have to be willing to pursue it together. So I'm going to end in prayer, and then I'm probably going to sit down and cry some more. It's that kind of day. Thanks, babe. Lord, I'm thinking of the songs that say that we will break every chain. And I've always envisioned one or two chains to break, but I know that there are so many more. And as intimidating as it is a blessing to know that you do it with us, that you have seen the way people and institutions have harmed us, and you still call us to take care of the most vulnerable, to create cultures of protection and safety, and to be present with you in what feels like unending and daunting work. I thank you that you have modeled for us a way of being. And I thank you that we are a community that seeks that together. And though it is hard and we don't know what next steps looks like and we don't know what will happen, I just thank you that you allow us to be present to one another, to feel our feelings, to name what hurts, and to extend care and connection so that we may make a culture that is rooted in you. It's in your name we pray. Amen.